Greetings to you, fellow internet dwellers. It is your host, Aphelion, and you are currently watching the Ephemeris podcast as we get into our 20th episode of our second season of the podcast regarding cosmology and cosmological theories across history. In the chronological timeline, we are approaching Isaac Newton and the 18th century, so we are edging closer to the end of the season. If you're new here, make sure to go watch the previous 19 episodes. Those are really fun. And before you do that, obviously, you're welcome to watch this episode. It's going to be probably the shortest of the season. So, yeah, I'd like you to stick around for that. And if you enjoyed the episode, I would also appreciate a subscribe. I know I leave that note at the end of podcast episodes, but I just wanted to leave that in the beginning so that everybody catches that message. So yeah, today's episode in that manner will be about Edmond Halley. And it's going to be a short episode. I think I just mentioned that. Mainly because of the fact that his work was very much observational and he didn't have much of like catalogs or writings about his theories or his reasoning behind his theories. So it's really just about what he did in his life and what he contributed to the field of science at the time. So yeah, let's get into it. You've heard of Halley's Comet before, and that's where the name comes from. He will contribute to Newton's biggest work and maybe the scientific work of all time, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. So let's get into it. As for a short biography of Halley, he was born into a relatively wealthy family in Haggerston, England in 1656. His father was a soap maker, so there was an abundance of wealth in the household, and he got access to astronomical instruments as a child, and he was quite excellent at mathematics and astronomy. So he ended up going to Queen's College in Oxford, where he became a protogee of John Flamsteed, who was the first Astronomy Royal of Great Britain. But little did anyone know that Halley would become the second. A unique part of Halley's education was that he hit the ground running. He was writing and publishing papers in his undergraduate years, which, I mean, you do undergraduate research, but dang, writing and publishing papers is like quite ahead of the game. He was observing the occultation of the moon and sunspots before he'd even completed his undergrad degree. Now that to me is insane. Like an average 21-year-old, any place at any time in human history could not define occultation. Like, I can't. I didn't even know the word existed before researching this episode. And Halley is studying it in his undergrad nearly 500 years before you and me were here on this earth. And you really could only aspire to be that prodigious. Like, being Halley at 21, writing, publishing papers, doing all these measurements, like doing Newton-esque work as a, aspiring to be that as a middle-aged scientist is kind of like aspiring to be Magnus Carlsen at 21 as a middle-aged title chess player. And on top of that, Halley left college without an undergrad degree because he was already receiving funds from the king to travel to St. Helena to observe and catalog stars in the Southern Hemisphere and voyage for 2 years. Like, dang, like imagine getting funding from the president himself to, do scientific research in these days. Could never happen. So yeah, Halley cataloged 341 stars in the Southern Hemisphere and discovered a star cluster in Centaurus. And he made the first observation of a transit of Mercury and realized that a similar transit of Venus could be used to measure the size of the solar system. Like, imagine doing all of that in the span of, like, literally 2 years. And this is going to spell success for Halley in the long term. And it's going to spell success on an incomprehensible level, to be real with you. Like, is there anything that would compare to this level of potential of becoming the greatest scientist to ever live? this amount of potential in one person who's like not even 25 is like kind of wild. And that's not all either. Halley received a Master of Arts under the command of the king anyway. So even though he didn't, stay for a bachelor's degree at college, he still got a degree, and it was a master's degree. And he got elected to the Royal Society at age 22. 1680, he worked with Cassini in Paris to observe the orbit of a comet, and in 1684, he met with the man, the myth, the legend, Isaac Newton. Like, this man is living the career of a scientist in the span of like 25 years, 26 years. Actually, here, he was 28 years old in 1684, and Newton was 42. Like, that's crazy. That's like the equivalent of Giannis playing with LeBron on the Lakers. Like, damn. Imagine that. But the real significance of Edmond Halley's career came when he became a civilian professor of astronomy at Oxford and wrote a synopsis of the Astronomy of Comets in 1705. And that's where the lovely Halley's Comet story comes in. He made the famous prediction of the return of what is now known as Halley's Comet in December 1758, and he was correct. He was only off by a few days, but he was within the month, pretty much. And yeah, so now we know that Halley's Comet is a comet that orbits the sun and returns every 75 years. So next one's coming in 2061. Yeah. It's unfortunate that he didn't get to see the comet return. I feel like that would have been a nice cherry on top, but I believe he knew he wasn't gonna survive to see it. I think that's what he said. Don't quote me on that. After this, Halley, sorry. I just want to make sure I'm catching myself, because there might be some times where I slip up. It is Halley. So, yeah, if I've said Halley too many times, definitely come at me in the comments. Halley devised a method for observing transits of Venus across the disk of the sun in order to determine the distance of the Earth from the sun. So this is kind of a sliver of method behind what he was doing on his voyages to St. Helena and all. And unfortunately, that's really all that can be said about Edmond Halley. I know we've talked about a couple of astronomers beforehand that have calculated like orbits for comets, but I think Halley's really the person here that's gonna put the gauntlet down and say, this is for sure how comets are. Because before Halley and Newton, it was sort of just like, they're just like out there. They're just kind of external objects of the whole solar system. So yeah, that's pretty much the gist of Halley's significance to the solar system model, heliocentric model, understanding the universe, and so on and so forth. He was an observational master, as you can tell from the information I've told you so far. He was also an amazing cartographer, which obviously isn't relevant to the discussions we have on this episode, but it's a cool thing to look into. Yeah, he dealt with a lot of map making and sort of theories about magnetic north and true north and sense of direction. So yeah, he was a pretty cool scientist overall, and that's all I have to say about him. If you enjoyed hearing about this short episode on Edmond Halley, thank you for staying to the end of the episode, first and foremost. And yeah, if you enjoyed it and you're listening on Spotify, drop a follow. I would appreciate that. If you're on YouTube, as I've already said, I would appreciate a subscribe. So yeah, that's all. I'm going to stop blabbering, and I will see you guys next week. Peace.